Thank you all. I have half an hour, so I will have to be really on point, on time. So start the watch. And this presentation that we're going to do, or that I'm going to do, is largely based on a research that I conducted together with Patrick, Petronella Mill, Anders Bergström, and some other collaborators. And I will discuss a little bit what we have found. So, as you know, the Stockholm Public Library is arguably Gunnar Asplund's most important work and a landmark for 20th century Swedish architecture. But yet, despite its stature, key aspects still remain under-examined, and largely because much of the archival material, especially from the execution phase, is missing or dispersed. And as a result, most writings on the library have focused on its design and history rather than its construction. But construction mattered deeply to Asplund, who visited the site frequently to confer with the foreman and resolve urgent issues. And the building now is undergoing a substantial renovation, and we have also the rare chance to then examine and survey the fabric directly, taking advantages of the openings in floors, walls, and shafts that are created by this renovation. And by adding on-site construction evidence to the literature, the aim that we have is to bridge the gap between the theory and practice and show that Asplund's architectural ideas are pursued with the same care, both at the large and the small scale, the detail and the whole, expressing the same ideas and ambitions. So for that reason, the construction is extremely integral part of the architecture of him. Just to give a little recap of what happened before and how Swedish modernism kind of evolved. I think it's important to then note that in the 19th century, it was believed by many that science and technology could be joined, and that by blending historical forms with modern techniques, architecture could also be reinvented for new uses. And this was especially exemplified in Auguste Choisy's Histoire de l'Architecture from 1899, which powerfully advanced the idea that architectural form could be a direct consequence of technological development. In Sweden, this lineage of thought was carried by Gustav Lindgren, who taught architecture at the School of Technology here in Stockholm. And in the early 19th century came a new movement of national romanticism or national realism, and a subsequent turn embraced craft and technology, treating the building more as a sculptural mass, where the space was kind of crafted out of or carved out of a block. And the movement's theoretical tenor was articulated largely by Ragnar Östberg, and its national inflection drew on the sort of mythologization of Swedish construction history, which is visible, for instance, in the Stockholm City Hall. However, both national realism or romanticism and Art Nouveau and other 19th century movements, they placed a strong emphasis on the material and ornamentation, but without encouraging necessarily deeper intellectual reflection. And in response to this condition, the 1910s, they started to center a lot on neoclassicism. So they returned to this kind of neoclassical idea. And the neoclassical influence, it came to Sweden through Germany primarily, who Sweden had close ties with. And for instance, Schinkel's works were started to be republished at that time. And we can really clearly see this trace in the, for instance, the 1912 graduation exhibition at the Royal Academy of Arts. And also Paul Letarui's Fils de Homme Moderne that I discussed with Anna yesterday. It became a key in studying in the courses of Erik Ladderstedt at the same school. So these were the kind of influences that were taken on and were kind of propelling the idea of the relationship between technology and architecture. And also an important thing that is easily forgotten today, I think, is that we have also this library coincides with the democratic movement. And with the advent of the parliamentary democracy around 1917 to 1921, there was a big push to try to democratize knowledge, and that started to gather a real force. And the idea of a public library became a civic matter, you could say. And Stockholm had explored such ideas already at 1909, but the scheme for a public library was stalled due to a lack of funds, and it was not until 1918 that the city council renewed the effort, appointing then a committee to investigate and propose how a public library could be organized and built. And crucially, a significant private donation prompted the city to reassess this type of questions, adding momentum to this kind of political will. But I think it's interesting that it was still kind of in relationship with the kind of private sector that this idea of the library could be materialized. And since there was not really a true Swedish precedent to lean on, Sweden had several libraries, but it was not like a public library that organized by the city at the time. The committee then started looking outwards, trying to study established models in the United States and England, but above all, also learning from the Nordic neighbors, where several cities already had operating public libraries. And these study trips and correspondence supplied practical lessons about access, collection, circulation, and spatial consequences of the open shelves that then became part of the library. And in this committee, Gunnar Asplund was also part of, together with several librarians, and that led to him contributing directly to the 1922 report, which was this kind of first formalization of this committee. And in that report already, Asplund is then providing some proposal drawings. And that means that Asplund had a kind of a dual role where he helped to translate this kind of policy into architectural form. And after years in the making, the library finally opened in 1928. But architectural culture had already moved very quickly during the 1920s. So by the time of the inauguration, younger voices were already somewhat critical. And there is this very famous, and I will reiterate it for the sake of this lecture, Uno Ren, who had previously worked with Asplund. For instance, he worked in the construction and the design of this cinema. He was very critical in his review that was published in the Swedish Review of Architecture, Arkitektur. And Orén, he had served also as a correspondent for the same magazine. And at the time, he was strongly influenced by these visits that he had done to Paris and the things that he has seen by Le Corbusier, especially the Esprit Nouveau pavilions, etc., a few years earlier. But despite the criticism of Asplund's peers, the library was more or less a success with the public and the residents of Stockholm, which Anders has written an article about, by the way. So what we see today is not only an adaptation, or let's say, of the 1928, but the library has since undergone several changes, and what we see is a kind of amalgamation of several layers of maintenance, as well as the large addition that was made in 1930, finished in 1932. More on that soon. But during the last renovation that was taking place, I think it was around 2022, we had the opportunity to then look at the renovation and examine the consequences of it, and to then go into depth and really survey how the building was actually done. So one of the things that we focused on, for those of you who have been in the library, in the rotunda, for instance, there are this kind of rustication, or these lumps that are on the facade, but that nobody really knows where they come from, because there is no archival material that either register or document them at all. So there's no text about them, there's no image that shows that they will be there. And because of that reason, it is a little bit mystery where these lumps came from. The rotunda finish, what we were able to see then when they cut up the two shafts in the rotunda was how this kind of lumps or rustication was actually built. And the finish is a kind of multi-layered mortar render that is applied in different varying thicknesses. That perhaps is not, let's say, something that we didn't assume. And by then varying the different thicknesses, they were able to then to create these kind of lumps. So they have, in a way that differs from the tender documents that are the latest, let's say, or closest to the execution phase that we have. But in a way, it's a slightly simpler detail than what was proposed from the beginning. But what is interesting also is that in the end, at the top of the rotunda, where the wall meets this kind of clerestory, the surface then folds inwards, which it's very subtle if you're standing there. But the shaft openings then show that this curvature is not made by solitary or solid masonry brick or something like that, but it is a kind of reinforced plaster that is built up, spanning between this concrete ring that lays, you can see around here, this concrete ring, and the structural masonry wall. Of course, this is a kind of common practice at the time, but it is a more, let's say, traditional way of also creating architecture, leaving this kind of substantial air gap. But the same, let's say, attitude that we can see in this kind of detail, we can also see in the plan of the library as a whole, or in the section for that matter, where we can see this kind of clash of this very clear, or you could say autonomous architectural shapes that then leave this kind of poché or this kind of thickness in which the stairs and other installations are taking in. And Asplund uses this kind of method very frequently, and I think that is very speaking also for his architecture of the 1910s and also the early 1920s, because for instance, some of you will see today that we can appreciate in this section of the Woodland Chapel from 1919, there is this kind of disassociation in between the exterior expression of the house or a building and the interior. So for Asplund at this time, these kind of things are not necessarily consequences of each other. The interior can be its own form and the exterior can be something else, let's say. Yes, and another space that we then looked at was the slabs of the 1932 extension that were also opened at this time. And Asplund's original scheme of the library in the 1920s already had envisioned a building with 4 wings enclosing the rotunda, but the west wing was cut for budget reasons, leaving the rotunda open towards Odenplan and Odengatan. And already in 1928's inauguration, the city commissioner Oskar Larsson publicly expressed that he had a hope that the missing 4th wing would soon be completed so that the building could appear as the architect originally had intended. And I think that it was a little bit shameful for them to kind of not complete the building as a whole. But the space shortages of the library, they were of course evident then from day one, one could say. And when the wing then eventually was planned, it was not in the way that it had been in 1924 sketch. The book storage and lecture hall were replaced by an additional special reading room and different staff rooms. And adjustments to the library's evolving needs had to be done. And the western wings in the 1924 proposal respected this kind of axial logic of the building as a whole and had 2 laterally placed back entrances that were framing kind of trapezoid book storage space that we see here in the middle. But however, when Asplund then in the proposed the 1930s edition, he really breaks, or let's say goes away from these kind of ideas. The reason for this was that in the 1930s he had been the commission to the he had served as the chief architect of the 1930 Stockholm exhibition, which, as many of you know, signaled Sweden's full embrace on modernism. And this shift from Nordic classicism to modernism is very evident in this 1932 part. And in the 1930 scheme, we can see that, for instance, this axial logic that was present in the building altogether is now broken, let's say, or neglected. Instead of entering in this kind of special reading hall in the middle or placing it centrally, we now enter it slightly from the side. And this kind of idea of this kind of poché that we usually see in the plan, here it is, at least in the plan, it's absent. And of course, you can find examples from 1930s onwards that show that he still uses the poché every now and then, but I think that it's not really in the same way, and it's very evident that it's not. And also the interior of the 1932 part, it really underscores this kind of full embrace of modernism. The cantilevered promenade is devoid of any supporting columns of any sort, or let alone any classical order. And instead, it is supported by 2 spiral staircases placed in the room's extremities and also through the cantilever itself. And the atmosphere of the space is also a direct consequence of the construction and the way of building and the detailing of this. And we can also see in this kind of stainless steel railing that it aligns perhaps more with a Bauhaus tube bending or like a boat, for instance, than any other classical tradition. So the extension here is not really an expression of a scenographic architecture, but rather one of that should show kind of the technical and constructive accuracy of the structure itself. And in the 1932 part, this we surveyed then a kind of slab that was just a little bit above this kind of reading hall. And what we found was that okay, to a certain degree, the tender documents corresponded to our findings, but of course, the precision in which those tenders documents were done was not able to, let's say, one was not able to construct it in that sense with that precision. And also, we can note that in the 1930s, floor construction really differed from the ones more traditional one in 1920s. Whereas the 1920 floors were a traditional kind of steel beam reinforced concrete slabs with a coke ash and lime gravel fill, as stating in the tendering documents, and also partially verified through ground penetrating radar scans made by Patrick Fleming and Nordscan. We can also see that in the 1930s floors, they started to introduce new materials. So instead of that coke ash and gravel fill, they were replaced instead by a new material called gasbeton or aerated concrete, which is a kind of lightweight concrete structure. That was placed over a steel mesh reinforced layer of an insulating straw material, so-called solomite. And the gasbeton then was developed at KTH in the 1920s, and it was kind of a very porous material. It was sourced from quarries around the Skövde area. So it was this very new product, so to speak, still very, let's say, Swedish, you could say. And the idea here was probably not necessarily to reduce the floor's self-weight, but to achieve other performance goals. So let's say acoustic or other constructive advantages. And I will focus a little bit in the rest of the time on the other material, this kind of straw material that we saw, which is the solomite. And the solomite was a kind of new building material that started to really gain prominence in the late 20s and the early 1930s. It was really, really pushed in the 1930s. For instance, we can see here that in the Stockholm exhibition of 1930, there were not one, but two pavilions of this material. So it is kind of the equivalent to a manufacturer showcasing its new material today, like in a fair or something like that. And the solomite was this kind of machine-made pressed straw material that under high pressure and could become non-combustible, so that it had like they really showcased this by like adding a blowtorch and showing that it doesn't like cause any it doesn't start to burn, basically it doesn't ignite. And in this kind of reinforce or straw material, they reinforced it then with galvanized steel, so in order to kind of keep this as a kind of panel. And that then meant that you could use it in several different scenarios. So what we can see here to the left is they present the product in a kind of rural scenario as a kind of thing that you can plaster on. And in this, in the pavilion to the right, that was in the more on the main area of the exhibition, they then show it so that it can be, like, let's say, used in a curve. And this is kind of the showing that it can also take on this kind of modern formal compositions. And the use of solomite in the 1930 library can undoubtedly be attributed to Asplund's critic and former employee, Uno Orén, who himself had used it in the 1930 exhibition for his row houses that he built at the Stockholm exhibition. And you can see here also in the image, this archival image, that the row houses themselves were kind of, I don't know, sponsored by solomite. So the material of the future was advertised on these modernist row houses of Orén. And Orén himself then, I think, had a very, I mean, it's not necessarily documented as such, but for me, I think it's very evident that he had a very great influence directly on Aspen, perhaps through this their close relation, but as well also through this critique and review. And Aspen, when he becomes also professor, he also lifts up the influence of, he talks about Oswald Spengler, but also Le Corbusier as these kind of main influences for his architecture, which I find very interesting, taking into account the 1920 library part, for instance. But this kind of Solomite, Uno Oren, he probably got it from Le Corbusier. This is what we put forward in the article, which, and Le Corbusier, he had used this material himself in the Esprit Nouveau Pavilion from 1925. And the use of Solomite and the construction then becomes this kind of direct materialization of the link between the modernist ideals and the architecture of the modern era and the modern movement. And and with the construction came also methods of organizing the spaces in a different way, or that you could do that due to this kind of technological advancements. So it was first, I would say, in the modernism, the reason that that was partly so quickly embraced, I think it's due to that being, let's say, the answer to this question that already was put forward in the 19th century of how can architecture and technology merge together. But with that said, even though this kind of Solomite traces to the kind of continental architecture, I think it's important to also remember that it was, in a way, of course, it was a new material, but it had a very clear link to traditional and rural ways of buildings. I mean, straw has been used since forever in construction, but however, now it was like on an industrial type of straw material. And at the same time, even though that this was kind of invented in France and the first patent was in France, the material that of the Solomite was sourced already. They had like a factory in Sweden, and the patent was kind of, yeah, they bought the rights to produce it in Sweden, basically. And it was sourced from the lowlands around Norrköping. So the material, in a way, it is both this kind of modernist new material as well as a kind of continuation of the kind of traditional ways of building. And it is usually said that the architecture, the modern Swedish architecture, is not necessarily cannot necessarily be seen as a kind of revolutionary rupture with history, but rather a consequence of this kind of progression that is ongoing. And I think that the Solomite, in a way, really incorporates this kind of transition or tradition that goes from being something traditional that then takes the form of something modern. And findings like these, they're just like we're just kind of scratching the surface, but they were only, of course, possible because we were able to then kind of collaborate with the practitioners that are actually doing the renovation in this case. And this kind of close collaboration has really enabled us to then document not only how the building was thought, but also how it was constructed, adding this kind of layer to the architectural history as a whole, and also connecting the construction with the architectural theory and those ideals. And in a way, one could say that this relationship between practice and, in this case, academics, is really goes both ways. In a way, the knowledge that we are able to then produce through these kind of new findings could inform the renovation process, which in turn would then inform the academic research again. So it becomes kind of this kind of circular condition where one helps the other, which in turn helps the first once again. So with that said, this new ongoing renovation also presents possibilities to then also explore further the construction of the library, and once and for all also document a little bit how it is done, not only for our time today, but also for the time in the future, for future renovations, to really know what it has been done and how that can be used in order to make changes and adaptations then. So with that said, thank you very much, and I'll leave the over to Patrick, which will talk about the acoustics. So thank you.